All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this conversation. We are just waiting for everyone to get a chance to join us. And please let us know your names and which organization you're with or from which location you are watching this. And we will start the conversation in a few moments. All right, thanks for joining us, everyone. So in this session, we are going to host our speakers in our ongoing series, Challenging Discrimination Through Community Conversations. And we are going to talk specifically about anti-racism and acts of solidarity. This has been a topic that has been of interest for a long time, as long as we have been running these roundtables. And we've had a lot of suggestions through the feedback that we received from the community that they would want to hear specifically about this issue. So we are planning to have two sessions. One is happening right now. This is the first part of the roundtable. And on the 25th, we will have a few other speakers who are joining us for the same topic in a slightly different context. So on this first session, we are hosting Mohammed Hashim, Executive Director of Canadian Race Relations Foundation, and Singh, who is the social innovator at Shift Lab, and also Stewart, who is the Human Rights Commissioner. And of course, I will introduce our speakers much better. On the second session, which is going to happen on the 25th of November, it's almost sold out, if I am not mistaken, but still there are a few spots open if you would like to register for this. In that session, we'll join a conversation with Samya, Hassan, who's the Executive Director of Council of Agencies Serving South Asians, Sarosh, Rizvi, who's the Executive Director of Alberta Association of Immigrants Serving Agencies, Debbie Owusu-Akyeeah, who is the Executive Director of Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity, and Parker Johnson, who is the founder of This Is Table Talk. So as for land acknowledgement, even though we are not gathered in the same physical space, we would like to acknowledge the land that CFRAC occupies on Treaty 6 territory, traditional homelands for many Indigenous peoples. With this acknowledgement, we pay our respects to the elders, past and present, who call this land home, and remind all of us gathered here today of the responsibilities we have as treaty people to understand our shared colonial history and work together towards a just future that includes and enriches all peoples. At the Center for Race and Culture, we're trying to go beyond the formal land acknowledgement and connect it to our current socio-political milieu in Canada and consider our parts as individuals, responding to acts of discrimination and moving towards a more inclusive society. As new settlers in this country, our perspective of Indigenous peoples is shaped by the legacies of colonialism. There are few, if any, interaction between new settlers and Indigenous peoples, and much of what newcomers to Canada learn about the Indigenous communities is informed by a colonial mentality and deeply rooted negative stereotypes. And while the Truth and Reconciliation Commission issued 94 calls to action to address the legacy of residential schools and move toward reconciliation, for many of us, it is unclear that reconciliation could or should look like in our everyday lives. A starting point is to take responsibility, recognize and acknowledge our own role in the legacies of colonialism, which continue to shape and appear and oppress Indigenous lives, so that we can seek out ways to work in solidarity with Indigenous communities. The impacts of colonial oppression do not simply disappear with the closing of the residential schools or the TRC, and we're only beginning to understand the intergenerational and psychological damages. So with this, I will move to a few points about the Center for Race and Culture. Since its establishment in 1993, the Center for Race and Culture, CFRAC, formerly known as Northern Alberta Alliance on Race Relations, has brought together diverse people with an interest in promoting and supporting individual collective and systemic change to address discrimination and racism and to encourage intercultural understanding. Taking an intersectional approach, our expertise spans workplace development, community building, research, and education. If you would like to learn more about current events, projects, or activities, please visit our website and or sign up for our newsletter. A little bit about our initiative. So this session is a part of our initiative, Challenging Discrimination Through Community Conversations, an ongoing series of online moderated roundtables and webinars with guest speakers from diverse communities, organizations, academia, and the general public. We seek to understand and address experiences of discrimination and exclusion in the Canadian context by shining the spotlight on different forms of discrimination, such as anti-Black racism or anti-Indigenous racism, or discrimination against more visible minorities in our community groups. We hope to encourage solidarity among groups and individuals interested in promoting social inclusion and equity. So if you would like to give us any suggestions or advice, as always, you can either contact me at consulting@cfrac.com or my colleague Miriam at projects@cfrac.com. And we would like to also acknowledge that our program has been funded by Edmonton Community Foundations. So at this point, we would like to run a very short poll. This is an anonymous demographic data collection. So I'm going to share a few questions with you, and we would appreciate if you could answer them so that we can take this feedback and the data that we collect and try to redirect our programming for the community. 10 seconds remaining for the poll. All right, thanks everyone for taking part in this. It will definitely help us improve our programming. So I will go ahead and introduce our speakers so we learn a little bit more about them. So our first speaker is Stewart Mikotapinokum, and I'm hoping that I'm pronouncing that correctly. Cam has been active in the field of diversity, inclusion, and human rights for over 20 years. He has received several awards for his work, including Jewish Repairing the World Award, YMCA Peace Medal, Baha'i Community Racial Harmony Award, the Alberta Outstanding Contribution to Community Adult Learning Award. He has been honored with an Eagle Feather from Elder Doreen Spence and been gifted a Blackfoot name of Mikotapinokum, or Red Morning, by Herman Yellow Old Woman. Under his leadership and guidance, the Calgary Police Service received the Calgary Immigrant Aid Society's Immigrant of Distinction Corporate Diversity Award and a Federation of Canadian Municipalities Diversity Award. He has advised hundreds of corporations, nonprofit organizations, and all orders of governments in developing equitable practices and removing barriers for all people. Cam is presently the Communication, Education, and Engagement Consultant for Alberta Human Rights Commission. And now we move to our second speaker. Samya Singh. Samya Singh is a social innovator and a steward at Shift Lab. He has worked for End Poverty Edmonton as a strategic planner, the World Indigenous Nations Games, as well as the Government of Alberta and Strathcona County as a systemic designer. He has been the co-founder of the Rotman Design Challenge. And a little bit more information about the organization. So they are a collective of people taking an action-oriented approach through a social innovation lab process to explore the intersection of racism and poverty in Edmonton. And on this slide, you can also learn more about their values they work with. They foster a safe experimental space, create solutions with community, embrace new ways of thinking and acting, and focus on impact. And I'm sure Sam will let us know more about these as we will engage in a conversation with them. Our next speaker is Mohammed Hashim. He's the Executive Director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. He is a labor organizer and human rights advocate who has dedicated his career to supporting equity, inclusion, and community empowerment. He is a member of the Board of Trustees of the United Way of Greater Toronto, treasurer of the Board of Directors of the Urban Alliance on Race Relations, and is a focusing advisor of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. The purpose of the Canadian Race Relations Foundations is to facilitate throughout Canada the development, sharing, and application of knowledge and expertise in order to contribute to the elimination of racism and all forms of racial discrimination in Canadian society. The work of the foundation is premised on the desire to create and nurture an inclusive society based on equity, social harmony, mutual respect, and human dignity. Its underlying principle in addressing racism and racial discrimination emphasizes positive race relations and the promotion of shared Canadian values of human rights and democratic institutions. A few notes about myself. My name is Mansour Modares. I'm the programs consultant at Center for Race and Culture, and I have over a decade of experience with post-secondary institutions, working as a researcher and educator. And my fields of work are transnational feminisms, intersectionality, community and narrative studies, and storytelling. I have been working with the center since January 2020, and I'm also the coordinator of the initiative. All right, so again, welcome to our speakers. Thanks a lot for joining us today. We're going to start our conversation, and I think probably the best question to start with is to try and define acts of solidarity when it comes to anti-racism, the discussions, projects. Please let us know from your perspective, from your experience, how would you define this concept? So anyone who's willing to go first? Maybe we can start with Mohammed.
Sure, but I think Cam was introduced first, so why don't Cam, Samya, and then I'll go last, maybe.
Sure, okay. Yes, absolutely. Let's Cam go first.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, and thanks for the opportunity here. And thanks, Mohammed, for passing the passing the baton over. Yeah, I think again, I wanted to acknowledge that I'm a visibly white person who's been doing this work. And I think even before we talk about the act of solidarity, the actors of who does this work, and one of the two terms that come to mind is something I went to a workshop last year hosted by the Calgary Foundation, and Tim Fox brought up the term of allies and edgewalkers. And in this work, I think an ally is someone who disrupts racism and creates work in the community where everyone thrives. And the term that I wasn't familiar with, but I really acknowledge, is the term edgewalker. And to me, that is someone who walks between the worlds and has the ability to bridge between the different worlds. And so looking at, my background, both in policing, both trying to the struggles within the police and helping community, my ancestry of being Arabic, that again, I'm not visible minority, but that's what I identify with. I think where we can look at doing that work and removing the barriers, which is the act, the barriers of racism, where everyone can contribute. And so, those are some thoughts that come to my mind.
Yeah, great points. Thanks so much, Cam. And then I guess Sam would like to go next.
Sure, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and to share some of the learnings that I've picked up with my colleagues at the Shift Lab in this context. I had to kind of wrestle with this question a little bit because solidarity to me has fairly political implications. And I kind of thought about what does it mean to act in solidarity with another? And to me, it's about support, but even more deeply, it's about empathy. And to me, the work that we do, especially around human-centered design, is very much rooted in empathy. It's rooted in walking in another person's shoes and being able to take that perspective. And so that is how we kind of charted our way towards creating some prototypes, which I can discuss a little bit later, which we hope will actually make a difference in combating racism and potentially change people's minds or open people's hearts and minds to address the issue of racism wherever it pops up in their community.
Yeah, very good points. Thank you. So disrupting racism, the idea of the edge walker, which was a beautiful metaphor in a way in this sense, and then removing barriers. Samir also added the idea of empathy, right? And how we can use this in order to redefine solidarity in a way. And now we can hear from Mohammed.
Sure. So first of all, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and also known as Toronto. So I'm really delighted to be here, and thank you so much for having me. How about I tell you like that you can define ally in many ways, but you don't get to define what ally is. Somebody who is looking for allyship, who's looking for support, gets to define what it is to be a good or bad ally. And I'll just maybe, instead of answering the question of how to do it, I'll tell you how not to do it. And I'll use myself as an example. So in early June, we were having a board meeting of the Urban Alliance on Race Relations, and our president, Nigel Barif, said, hey, how about we adopt a position to support defunding the police? And our board, and including myself, was like, hold on a second, we don't really understand what that means. Does that mean abolishing the police? Does that mean, changing different services? We don't know what that means. We're quite connected to the city government. So if we take a position like this, is this going to harm our relations with city councilors? Are they going to look at us as some group that is not in line with public discourse? Or are they going to see us as too far out? So nonetheless, our board said, let's just wait before we take a position on it and figure out, how do we actually think about it? And I thought to myself, I was like, here is a Nigel's Black, and he was pushing for this, and he was saying, I need you guys to support us on this. And the rest of us, including myself, was just like, hold on a second. And 2 weeks after that, there was a man named Ijaz Chaudhry in Toronto, just outside of Toronto, who was killed by the police. I went the day after to talk to the family and find out, what happened. And, it turned out that he was a 62-year-old man who had severe mental health illnesses. They had called the police for help. And after a series of interventions where the police, but also like the family and everybody else was trying to intervene to de-escalate the situation, the police decided, forget about all that, let's just go in. And then right or the moment when they were going to make contact, before that, outside the person's house, the police officer shot the person and killed him. He was 62 years old. The man could barely hold a cup in his hand without it shaking so much that it would, he could be of harm to anybody. And when I heard those stories, it really made me think about, from my perspective as a brown settler of South Asian descent, what are my expectations of the police? Maybe I thought the police would do their due diligence on stuff. Maybe I thought that they would be fair in terms of how they dealt with it. But in that moment, I realized that what happened there was just wrong. And then when I spoke to Nigel about it, he said, well, this is what's been happening to us forever. How the police had been used as an instrument to control us, to suppress us, to be able to control how Black lives lived. And the call for defunding the police wasn't just like to abolish the police, but really was a frame to be able to say, look, we need to look at what policing is doing, how it's impacting, and really critically look at that. And I think that what that taught me was a lesson to say, I didn't understand how he saw policing until the moment when I had to show up at somebody's house who was killed by the police and talk to their family members and talk to their kids. You have 3 kids that were, all under the age of 14, I think, that were left without a father. So I think when we talked about acts of solidarity, it's about really emphasizing the point that Samya made around empathy. It's about really trying to understand beyond what your knee-jerk reaction would be on an issue, and hearing somebody from where they're at, not just what they're saying right there, but what they're saying, the weight of it, how much it carries, how much it has formed their identities, how much it's actually shaped their perspective of this world. And I think part of what people need to do in terms of just even honestly acts of solidarity is being able to have the openness to hear where people are at and understand where they're coming from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very, very thought-provoking point. Thanks so much for sharing the story with us. And that's also another point, right, that could come up in these conversations when, yeah, there are talks of defunding the police, right? And in what different ways this could be looked at, or what does this exactly mean, as you suggested, in so many different contexts, right? That we hear about police brutality, and well, especially as we hear about it in the context of the States, but as well as Canada, we see that happening here as well. Thanks so much, everyone. So the next question that we have here, I think there is a technical difficulty with our slides, but the second question is that in our previous conversations with our guest speakers, we've been talking a lot about systemic racism. We've been talking about institutional racism. That is, again, as the minister suggested over a week ago, it runs very deep in Canada, and it's pretty layered in all aspects of our society. But moving towards, in a way, collaboration and acting in a way as an ally, right? Considering acts of solidarity. Can you tell us a bit more about your experience, or the experience of your organization when it comes to collaboration with the racialized community groups, or in general acts of solidarity? So again, if you would like to keep the order, we can definitely start with Cam, but feel free to go ahead and share your experience with us regarding any projects, any specific mandates that you've been working with to achieve moving towards a more united nation or community.
Well, I can share one of the prototypes that we've been working on, which I think kind of addresses this question really well. And I know I kind of overwhelmed you with a bunch of slides that we went through quickly, but the one that's exploring Wakotewin, if you can go back to that one. So this is, I think, a really cool idea, and it came out of one of our initiatives at the Shift Lab. And it's basically, it's a board game that is designed to explain the history of settlement across the Canadian prairies, but from the numbered treaty perspective. So in this case, this is an historical board game from the Treaty 6 perspective of what it was like when Western settlement occurred in Alberta between, I would say, 1870s to the turn of the century. And the idea for this actually came out of a question which we shared amongst ourselves at the Shift Lab, which was, what does it mean to be a Treaty 6 person? So under the auspices of Treaty 6, we are all signatories to it if we live here in treaty land. So we are responsible for upholding the treaty in a sense, whether we are familiar with the exact wording of it or not, but it falls on our shoulders as settlers in Treaty 6 territory. So what came out of that question was the idea of creating a board game, which is as an instructional tool, as a way of showing people this is what it meant from the Treaty 6 perspective, from the Indigenous perspective, of what it meant to have settlers come and encroach on this territory a century and a half ago. And so it is a really interesting exercise because it meant kind of revisiting a lot of things about, when you think about a board game, you think about winners and losers, and you think about what is it that you're collecting, what is it you're, if it's Monopoly, you're trying to basically become a landlord and make the most money, and that's how you win the game. So we kind of took that paradigm and flipped it on its head, and we said, okay, well, what is it if you were an Indigenous person in Treaty 6 territory, what are the things that you would value? So if you looked at the slide, you can see some of the cards on the side here were things like knowledge, for example, traditional knowledge, tools and skills. Those are assets that you rely on to participate in the game. And then you also rely on things like the bison, which represents food, shelter, clothing, multiple different uses for how the bison was used, as we know, but also berries and medicines, which were collected by different First Nations. And those are the things that gave value in this game. And so the idea is that with this board game, which we are still testing, we're testing the concepts and the gameplay mechanisms. We're testing the ability of, can these concepts of things like, food shortages, or the arrival of the Indian agent who actually acts as a negative force in the game. So you lose knowledge cards when the Indian agent comes and basically claims some of the assets that you've been building up. And the goal of the game is to collect the most knowledge cards of Indigenous knowledge. And what we find is that with this game is it's a completely different way to kind of illustrate a history that has been obscured for a long time and is only now sort of being rediscovered. I think most Canadians now are fairly familiar or have some understanding of the residential school system that was implemented across the country, especially here in Alberta, which had the most residential schools. But we feel that this game is a way of broadening that history so that it's not just a tragic history that people are grappling with when they understand, when they're trying to understand the Indigenous perspective, but also a history that really touches on the land and how important the land was and how important the natural environment was and is for communities in this territory. And so we hope it's kind of a neat way to flip the paradigm and be both an educational tool, but also something that is, it conveys learning in a way that's not just, a simple textbook or a series of blog posts or whatnot, but rather encourages kids especially, but also adults to learn through doing by playing this game.
Yeah, this is really, really interesting to see. So the other question about this is that how did you connect to, with students or kids around the community to actually know about this and be able to consider it as a board game and learn more about these issues?
Well, so we connected with the Indigenous Knowledge and Wisdom Center, which is based out of West Edmonton, and we spoke with Elder Ron Lehman, who provided most of the content and turned the history and the values of what First Nations valued at the time, as well as some other Indigenous folks from the IWKC who contributed. And then kind of going back to an earlier point, the interesting thing is that the project manager who kind of steered this whole exercise is herself, a Muslim woman wearing hijab who immigrated to Canada, about 15, 20 years ago. So she is kind of bringing her lens as a non-white settler, but as somebody who's a newcomer, also kind of grappling with what as a newcomer, as somebody who's not from European ancestry, what is her obligation and what is her responsibility as a treaty person. So it was really a neat experience to have Rabia Nasir, that's her name, to be in the driver's seat for putting this together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting. Thanks so much for sharing, Samya. And Mohammed, did you?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think the primary like there's a saying that we use, like there's nothing about us without us. So if you're doing any programming around anything, if it's anti-Asian sentiment, racism, or it's anti-Black racism, and you're just kind of looking at it from like, well, from my perspective, this is what we should be talking about. It really, to be honest, is a bit disingenuous. You need to be able to have real conversations with real people who are affected by it, to be able to bring their perspectives into the conversation and allow them the room to be able to lead it. And sometimes that means that, because like, to be frank, like I am I'm a brown man from South Asian descent. Like, I don't know your experience. Like, I can try to understand it to a certain degree, but like, I'm never going to actually fully get it, right? I'm going to look at it from what I've experienced my entire life. So the ability to kind of say that, and instead of saying, well, I know where you're coming from, which is not true, because you don't really know where somebody else is coming from. To be able to say, okay, here, let's work from that premise to say, okay, here, I'm going to be open enough to be able to hear where you're coming from, and believe you. And if we can't start from that, then it really, the conversation is a conversation between power, where one person has power versus over the other, and not allowing that freedom to be able to have that honest exchange. And sometimes it takes, honestly, a relationship to be able to have those difficult conversations, because I'm not going to open up to you unless I know that you're going to be able to receive it with some type of responsibility. So if you can't do that, then, and you just want to hear somebody out because you want to hear somebody out, then like, that's not really a fair starting point. In terms of like the foundation for what, like, some of the approaches that we're taking, is that, there's many ways where we can help. Like in the next couple of weeks, we're going to be releasing a grant. There's small grants that like anti-racism organizations can apply to us for, that allow us to kind of build a relationship to figure out what are the things that you're doing. Is it amplifying an issue? Is it pushing for a legislative change? Is it, is it building a community coalition around an issue? Are you trying to solve a problem collectively? And part of what we're hoping to do is reach out to different communities and figure out what's important to them. I'll give you a quick example. There's this thing called the Action Chinese Canadians Together ACT Foundation. I think it's based out of Calgary, my understanding is, but they run a coalition of about 40 Asian organizations across Canada. And they came to us to say, look, we, like, in the rise of anti-Asian sentiment, coming from how people perceive China to be, how COVID is now being framed, how, and what that is doing, that's triggering to them a very long sense of anxiety around what the yellow peril could look like. Because many of our organization was created out of the 1998 Japanese Redress Agreement, where Japanese Canadians were interned in Canada in camps during World War II, and the apology of which the government gave in the 90s was the creation of our organization. So I think, no matter what program we're doing, and what the ACT Foundation, what we're trying to do is help them work within their own communities to better understand what anti-Asian sentiment is. And to be honest, I'm not going to lead that. I can maybe support them financially, but I don't know what that feels like. I don't know what you hear that is going to make you think or feel discriminated. But I want to be able to work with people who and have a relationship with people who are going to be able to express that clearly and help all of us understand that better.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for your ideas, Mohammed. So yeah, let's go to Cam and see he has
some great points. I just wanted to add to them and amplify them. As one, Mohammed was talking about power, and I also look at, there's that some discomfort or some not knowing about the idea of power and privilege. And I think one of the things is identify with that power is what what power or privilege do I have as a middle-aged white man with a certain amount of education, and how can I use that? But also what my organization has. What power does it have, either as a funder or within the Alberta government? Within my geographic area, I'm in the Treaty 7 area, living in Calgary. And so what power and privilege does that allow me to do? And how can I use that? Like the old Spider-Man saying, you know, how do I use my power for good? And, you know, we've done that. You know, we've worked with, and I've worked with Sam with the, you know, with the Shift Lab. And, you know, we brought Trevor Phillips, they brought Trevor Phillips. We helped amplify that. And when Trevor Phillips came up a couple of years ago, to talk about racism and how to address it, both as a systemic and individual way of governments. I've been working on one of the anti-racism programs with the Shift Lab on a bystander project. I think it's just beautiful what they've done. They've developed a real interesting brochure and thing that I think we should go right across the province. And so how do I amplify that, both as using my influence as what funds or little funds that we may have to do that? I think it's really important on what we can use our organizational influence or our political influence because we know somebody or we know someone in an organization. Hey, you should fund this. Yeah, and Mohammed, to your point about the ACT to End Racism project that they're doing in Calgary. You know, I've been working with them. We were able to divert some funds to help that going, and it's a great tool. They're so innovative with their social media and the work that they're doing. Again, it's more than a government agency could ever do because they are on it. They are lived experience. They've got the knowledge base, they've got the motivation, and they have gone leaps and bounds much quicker than any government or larger nonprofit could go. They've been so flexible. So I think we really need to see what we can do to divert our resources to important and timely issues that come on us all the time. And communities are the best ones to know that always.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think very important ideas came up in this conversation, different ways that we can contribute to the community, especially when it comes to the racialized or more, in a way, marginalized community groups. One is the perspective of designing projects, right, that would educate the community about those struggles, and at the same time would bring them into a form of action, right? Even if it's in the form of a game, we're still thinking of putting ideas into action, which could be a step forward. The other point that came up was that it's by knowing, by understanding those struggles better that we are ever able to actually move towards a solidarity movement or contribute to acts of solidarity. Mohammed brought up this important point where we would want people to connect on a level that they are not just sympathizing with someone, but empathizing with them, right? I'm always reminded of Brené Brown's work on empathy versus sympathy, and how they are two very different experiences, as saying that, okay, I can see you suffering or not being able to move those barriers, which is a sympathetic, in a way, attitude. Whereas when empathy is concerned, we are walking in someone else's shoes. So we are trying our best to hear them. We're trying our best to understand their struggles and then be able to somehow work with that. Cam also suggested the part that the governmental organizations, the programs, funders play in this way, right? In the way that they facilitate nonprofits, different organizations to educate the community, and at the same time to fund those projects where we are motivating the community members to collaborate with one another, to learn more about one another, to create a spaces for everyone to be heard first and foremost, and then be able to contribute with those projects. Thanks so much for all the great notes. And that, in a way, I apologize again for the issues that we've been having with our slides, but we are finally here. This is our third question that you are seeing on the screen, which is what authentic acts of solidarity can be implemented now that we've talked about these different perspectives in our personal and or professional lives, how we can incorporate these ideas, whether it's something that we can do personally or we can do in our position as a professional to actually connect better to the experiences of racialized individuals, and to be able to work on systemic change as a collective, as a community. So I'm not sure which one. Yeah, Mohammed, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think we're kind of rotating that way.
Yes.
You know, I don't know what your professional lives are for the 47 participants that are here. So I think you can all figure out, but I'll tell you, at least from my personal perspective, you know, part of like what I find the conversation around race to be, right, because right now, like the conversation about race is very much alive in Canada. And a lot of people are just tired from it. Sometimes I'm tired from it. I go to rooms where, you know, there's 25 people and someone says, hey, we need a diverse perspective. And then I look around and I guess they're pointing towards me because I'm the only one there. And it's both like heavy and annoying. But what do? Do I just say, okay, well, I mean, I really don't want to have to explain like why this thing is so wrong so badly to all of you, but you know what, let's just do it. Because like there's nobody else in the room that will do it. So I find myself to be that person that has to deal with that a lot. But I would also say is that, you know, because the conversation around race is so loaded right now too, people make mistakes all the time, and I make mistakes all the time. And, you know, and I think what is absolutely needed from everybody on a personal level is just to have slightly softer hearts, where you're able to, like, you know, be able to hear somebody with a bit more empathy, be able to share a bit more with a bit more trust. Because I think in Canada, and, you know, especially when you look at down south, like the level of polarization around race is extremely high, and people have their backs up. Like, I don't want to talk to you if I know that you're going to be a jerk about it, right? Like, I don't necessarily even want to engage with you. But I think that this moment allows a responsibility for all of us, whether you're racialized or not, whether you're a minority or white or whatever you might be, to be able to say, okay, here, let me soften my position of where I'm coming from, to be able to hear people and not just like hear them, but feel them. And I think that's a critically important thing, just as a personal way of engaging in a conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think this makes a lot of sense because we're aware of those barriers, right? Even when we think about them personally, as you suggested, Mohammed, we can't necessarily know about everyone's experience, and we don't know how they may react until we actually try, right? But there may be this sort of collective barrier when it comes to different racialized communities, where you may have your guard up based on the experiences that you've had, right? Or the non-racialized group, where they are not able how to penetrate those barriers, where to start, right? Which often cause some issues. So I think Cam is going to
Yeah,
add more points.
sure. I wanted to just follow up what Mohammed was saying, and I think this is this area is very it's not polarized, but it's also very draining for everyone. For those who've experienced racism, and for others who are challenging it. And I think one of the things I've learned doing this for many years is making sure and looking after mental health, your own and others in the room or in the space, and checking in, because it is. I mean, I've had to, I know many of my colleagues doing this work have had to take off mental days, mental health days, or taking leave. It is very, it goes to the core, and I myself have had to reorganize my life sometimes, because it has been very daunting doing this work and in the trenches like so many other people. And so I think we have to really watch that mental health aspect for everyone in these conversations. And even create what I've tried to do is find mentors or create a community of practice, to find someone to that I can cheer when things go good, in that solidarity when things are going good, and high five, or I can phone them up and cry on their shoulders when whatever we're working on didn't go as good, or the internal struggles I'm having with my organization or colleagues isn't going as good. So I think I think it is important, those two aspects on the mental health. And third, in regards to what Mohammed mentioned about being in those spaces, we talk a lot about safe spaces, and one of the terms that again, one of my friends in the Indigenous community down south talk about is about creating brave spaces. And how do we create those spaces that, yeah, it might not be safe, and I might be hurt through the process, but let's have those authentic conversations, and again, not damaging, but let's open ourselves up a little bit to what's happening, and realizing, what, I may not feel safe here because the other party in the other room, they've got a different political persuasion, or I can see they've got a vent in their conversation, but let's learn through that conversation. And so I think that, finding, creating those terms of reference and creating a brave space is important, if we can do as an organization or a person.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Samir, did you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I first of all, I totally agree with both Cam and Mohammed about how this is it's going to be very trying work and very mentally exhausting. And as cynical as some people might want to be about politics, when I saw President-elect Joe Biden give a speech on Saturday, and he said, "Let's give each other a chance," I felt that really resonated with me personally, because I know that in conversations about racism, I often say there's, no right way to talk about race, but 100 wrong ways to do so. And I feel like giving ourselves, some space and some flexibility and some forgiveness to be able to have those conversations is essential. And then zeroing in on the question, actually, I can kind of mention another prototype that we have, even though we're kind of on a waiting list, so we're not taking any more subscribers. But I would say if anybody wants to learn more, they can subscribe to the anti-racism box. So if you can move us to the "You Need This Box" slide. This idea came out of our core question, which was how do we get folks, especially white folks, to confront white fragility? And how do we get them to kind of grapple with that idea? So the slide that shows the "You Need This Box" kind of illustrates this. So what it is it's a subscription box that comes in the mail, and it's meant to help folks, mostly white, but not only white. I mean, there's lots of people of color who've gotten this as well, to kind of go down this journey of understanding the role that race can play in their lives. And it's a box that basically you open it up, and it's got different articles and pieces of information about how racism exists here in Edmonton, both historically but also in the present day. And it's got a journal, so it allows people to record your thoughts. And we have that. I think it's slide 13 in the slides I sent you, Mansoure.
Yeah, I'm trying to share my own slides because I think on the other side it's not working. Probably they're not able to.
Oh, yeah, there. It is. So it's on the left-hand side where you see the 3 yellow stickies. That's the prototype. So that's what our core team was kind of scribbling down, was what were their thoughts. So one part of it was, changing hearts. Part of it was opening minds. Part of it, I think the third sticker says walking with your feet. So, not just talking the talk, but walking the walk. And the idea is, what if you got a box, so something that just kind of showed up and you had to go through it. So it's not screen based, and we deliberately wanted to make it not screen based because we feel like if people can actually touch something and flip through it, like as they do with a magazine or with a game, then they'll internalize it a little better. So in the right-hand slide, you can see some of, I think there's a little journal, there's a bulletin, which we call the Anti-Racism Today. So it kind of highlights aspects of racism here in Edmonton. There's 2 jars of Saskatoon berry jam to kind of also show that, to kind of impress upon people the importance of Saskatoon berries on Cree First Nations culture in the prairies. And there's other stuff, but we're not actually that explicit about what's in it because we don't want folks to kind of go through everything, take pictures, and put it on Instagram. In fact, we had one person who specifically wanted to do that and to tell the world about this journey that she was taking, and we asked her not to, because we don't want this box to be seen as kind of like a gimmick where it's like, oh, I've got my box, therefore my racism problem is solved. I'm not racist. It's not meant for that. And it's not meant to be Instagrammed. It's not meant to be shared in that way. It is meant to be shared in a discussion group. So if a couple people who got this box all, came together and they kind of discussed amongst themselves and they talked about what they were reading, what they were thinking, what their emotions were going through it, then it's meant to be shared in that way. And the thing about this box is that it launched in June, so shortly after the killing of George Floyd. So the demand for this box has blown way past what we budgeted for and what our expectations were. Initially, we were going to have about 30 of these first boxes going out, but we've had to send out over 1,000, not just in Edmonton, but across Alberta and across the country, because people were so, in tune with confronting racism after George Floyd's murder, that everybody really wants to get to understand this and to grapple with this, and we feel that having a box was a better solution than just something that you would do on a screen, because we feel like it would penetrate a bit more. And so, and the box itself is funded by ECF. Actually, everything the Shift Lab has done is funded by the Edmonton Community Foundation. And we just secured a grant from the Stollery Foundation to do the second series of boxes. And we're actually still looking for funding for the third and fourth boxes. And hopefully we feel, that's a good way from Mohammed. Yeah, hopefully we feel that this is a new entry point into these conversations about racism. Mm-hmm. Because as the other speakers mentioned, it can be very heavy, very draining work. And so we're hoping this can be a new way to have that conversation or to start that conversation. Yeah,
this is a great idea. And I can see we also are getting a positive reaction from our participants on this. It's a great way to engage the community, definitely, in taking an action, right? Taking a step forward. Which is great. Mohammed, I think, wanted to add to this point. You're on mute, sorry.
Like I wasn't going to, but Samir just made
Oh,
me think
sorry,
about
I
something.
just
That's
saw
okay.
you.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I just there's one. I don't know if this is appropriate or not, but you know, I'm a person of faith, so my activism, a lot of it is inspired by faith, and there's a scripture that I kind of live by that says, you know, not equal are the good deed and the bad, and repel evil by that deed which is better, and thereupon the one whom between you and him is enmity will become as though he was a devoted friend.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I, you know, in terms of how I personally conduct myself in difficult situations, particularly around race, is just, you know, try to be a better, decent person in the conversation. And I think, you know, just as a personal advice, like a piece of advice, I think that guides me. Like, you know, my faith doesn't tell me to take revenge on somebody who's done horrible to me, but to be better and to be higher in my response. And I think, and and time again, people who have done me wrong in this world, I've been attacked 1,000 times for many things that I've done. Sometimes many of my own fault too. And but even the ones that were unfair, those people I've reached out to and be able to have conversations with, and they have become some of my best protectors. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's at the end of the day, it's about creating those spaces, right? And we can definitely do that as individuals in our personal lives and our personal practices. We can definitely incorporate those features and values in order to move closer to the ideal, in a way, relations that we want to have with different community groups. And the other thing is that how we keep them going, right? Like there are these very good projects. One issue usually for, especially when we're talking about nonprofits, is about getting the funding, right? And being able to continue a project that Samir suggested. The other issue is usually how to reach out to the community, right? How to make sure that they know about this space. They know about, as Cam suggested, not necessarily a safe space, but a brave space if they're interested to take part in these community conversations, right? So there are usually these two barriers, in addition to everything else that was brought up to the conversation, that make it a bit harder and this journey a longer one in a way. But any different suggestions, any different experiences that you've had regarding giving a space and providing this space for the community? Again, it could be from your own experience or working with your organizations. Any way that you were able to mitigate, in a way, these issues and be able to engage the community members more in acts of solidarity?
Well, I think, as Mohammed said, you know, it, as being an ally, an edgewalker, or somebody in those spaces, we should be identifying who's not in that space and who's missing, and also not asking of that person of color or that person of difference to be the spokesman for their race or the other. And so I think we really have to be acknowledging that. I mean, I've done that many times, and I think other people out there should be doing it and saying, you know what, I cannot speak up for the disability community. We need, if we're going to talk about disability issues or youth issues or elder issues, we need to have more representation of them at the table. And I think, as Mohammed said, you know, we have to make sure that nothing about us without us, and have those voices heard early on, and not at the end of a consultation, but throughout the whole process from beginning to start, using a real community development lens, or at least a very participatory lens. As soon as we start thinking about it, let's not go down down a path too long before we have the voices of those people who may be impacted by the outcomes.
Right. Yeah. So it would be, in a way, providing that space when it comes to government, or in a way, organizations with more power and funding to create those spaces, or to help nonprofits or other community organizations to, in a way, engage the community in those talks. But again, going back to the experiences of nonprofits, what has your experiences been like? And we have some questions as well. So let's talk about this briefly, and then we'll shift to the next question. Let's go to Samya. I think you wanted to add something.
Sure. And this is kind of going back to the root theme of solidarity, and it ties into our last prototype, the one that Cam and I have been working together on. And that's the de-escalator guide. And that was a really interesting experience, because the question was, how do we address racial harassment when it happens in a public place? You know, we've seen all those videos of people being harassed, on a train, in a bus, or on a train station, or on the street. And we kind of wanted to think instead of just pulling out your phone and recording it, is there a better way for somebody to make an intervention? And actually, the inspiration for this and a lot of the lessons for this came from how guides that had been produced by women dealing with sexual harassment in public places. So we, if you can bring up that one slide that has the de-escalators brochure, the idea was, how do we, yeah, that's the one. So the idea, you can see a little cartoon. There's a story about Johnny, who is a member of our team, an Indigenous member of our team, who's being harassed by, I think, campus security at a post-secondary institution. And we got his story and a few other stories in this guide. But what we also did is we kind of created a checklist of things to do. So, what is the situational awareness? So, are you seeing somebody being harassed? Are you by themselves, or are there other people who can intervene? Is there an authority figure, or is the authority figure the one doing the harassing, and so forth? And so what we did is we kind of shared this with the Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton, SACE, and with Hollaback, the organization in the US, that have specifically sprouted up to deal with sexual harassment on the street. And we found that there's a lot of similar techniques. There's, I think there's an acronym, direct, distract, delegate, and delay. I think that's used when it comes to how do you intervene if somebody's being harassed by a stranger and you want to help them out. So those are tactics that can be used in that way. And so we incorporated that into this particular type of guide as a way so that if you see somebody being harassed, this is a way to kind of exercise that muscle memory, in a sense, to kind of understand, okay, here are certain things that you can do to kind of improve that situation for that person. And where this prototype is now, we're working with Cam and a few other folks, and it's actually kind of evolving towards an anti-bullying guide. So we're potentially looking to test it out in a couple of high schools to be used as a way of stopping bullying in those circumstances. And it may not end up there. It's still a work in progress, but I'm hoping that that's where we'll see it potentially sometime in 2021.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you for sharing, Sam. So I'm going to turn to the questions that we have. The first one is actually a very interesting question that we're getting from one of our participants, which reads as, from a solidarity perspective, what in your opinion is one biggest issue that is lacking in anti-racism work that is currently being done across Canada? So if anyone would like, yes, Mohammed, please go ahead.
Yeah, I want to answer actually both of them together, if you don't mind, because the second question is also really like as poignant. like in terms of like, I think right now there's a lot of desire for there to be anti-racism work. I'm not really sure how much, the rubber hits the road on this stuff, to be frank. Because I mean, there's a lot of like excellent statements around this and that, but like when it comes down to culture or how we, see our organizations react to things, there's a lot to be said there. So I think, part of, from a solidarity perspective, is saying, okay, here I can see a problem, but like, how much am I actually going to get involved to solve it? I think that like some people will see it and say, okay, well, that's really terrible, and some people will say it, okay, and say, let me step up and drive and help drive towards a solution. Maybe that's not maybe creating the solution, but creating the environment for a solution to be created. And I think that drive is the single biggest lacking problem, and I've seen it everywhere. In terms of equity committees, I've done a ton of work with school boards, mostly on the advocacy side, where parents who have dealt with anti-Black racism are just not being heard. Where I remember my friend, her son, somebody in class was like, gave like her son a KKK hat and said, put this on. And obviously that was like insanely traumatic to him and to their family. But the school board did nothing. They said that whatever, it was just kids being kids and like let it go and whatnot. And we launched a campaign against that. And then when we did, other parents came forward. And then other parents had even I'm not more egregious things, but many egregious things. And then it turned into a point where the school board had to fire their director, a trustee had to quit, the ministry had to step in and put it under almost administration, and did a whole report on systemic racism because the school board had failed so dramatically. And I think, equity committees, I love and hate the names of equity committees, but like, the inclusion of different voices is very important. I find in many places that equity committees are being created for us to be able to hear things, but then they come up with recommendations that either are met with, well, we don't have the time to do this, we don't have the resources to do this, this is not a priority of what we're doing, this doesn't fall into what our business plan looks like. And then that deflates people because somebody's come forward and said, hey, these are things that are wrong that I'm trying to deal with, help you deal with. And then you're going to come and say, well, just not good enough, or just not right now, and that's really deflating. So I think that making sure like those committees actually have some money, some actual resources by some actual power where they have maybe a direct line to like the director of education or whatnot, or the board, where they're reporting to mechanisms that will take action and are transparent in their recommendations. Those things are very important. And I think that otherwise, like if you don't take those, it actually does more harm than good when you invite somebody to a table to say, hey, let's have a conversation about it, and then have a meal without them. And that's what happens many times.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just echo Mohammed's points that you may not be able to create the solution, but you can help create the environment that allows a solution to be created. And I feel like that's really key. So for the work that we do, for example, we know that transportation can be a barrier for people to participating, or childcare can be a barrier for parents. And so whenever possible, we strove to either provide, bus tickets for people to come to our space on Saturdays so they could participate. And if they couldn't find a babysitter, then we were okay if they brought their children with them. You might see one slide, there's a woman with her, 6-month-old newborn. And it can be a challenge in a sense to have a 6-month-old child in an environment. But at the same time, if the cost of a person's participation is that their child has to be with them, then we have to make space for that. And so we can create an environment, literally a corner of the room, where kids can be, if that's what they need to be to get their parents into the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Samya.
Yeah, and I wanted to just add, I think a couple things that I am afraid of, again, I've seen this many times over the last 20 years that I've been in this field, is the cyclical nature. Organizations pop up, it's the flavor of the day. They say, yes, we're going to do something, and then their feet are not held to the fire. And I think we really need to look at keeping organizations and business units accountable to say they're going to do something. Okay, 6 months later, what did you do? What has been done? And then not, when things tail off, how do we keep that up? And so I think we need to be accountable. And I think the other thing that's missing is, I think it's great, Mohammed, that the Canadian Centre has a grant, a small grants, but there's not, as you know, there's not enough funds for this. I look at the province, our province does not, and most provinces don't put enough grant funding into grassroots organizations to do this. City of Calgary just had a grant call. Again, they were oversubscribed. The province is oversubscribed. There's more need in here than municipalities, provinces, the federal government has for funding the need. And I think that's that's a huge thing. And I know organizations like the Center for Race and Culture, they're struggling. Organizations in Calgary are struggling because, to do this work, it takes well-paid, well-knowledged individuals to do the work. And we got to make sure that, again, we're paying people, fair wages to do this anti-racism work. We're paying the volunteers, we're paying honorariums to people that are standing up and participating in these conversations, because everyone's, they're knowledge keepers, they're elders in their own sense. And we're expecting just to drag that knowledge out from them without compensating them for their input. So I think we really need to look at our whole system of what does that look to get participation from people in this area and give it credibility.
Exactly. Yeah. One of the issues is the other question was suggesting is the idea of tokenism, right? And that, there is, like, for some organizations, it would be just a box to be checked, but not really being held accountable for what is being done in practice for that. But yes, as you suggested, accountability needs also a seat at the table. Right, we need to have those inputs from different communities, from different experiences, in order to be able to plan better and help hold them accountable at the same time. And I guess Samir wanted to add something.
No, I'm good. I might just add that, yeah, I mean, as Cam mentioned, definitely governments are struggling, especially in this era of COVID. So I think it's also appropriate for us to be knocking on corporate Canada's doors for funding. I mean, if TD Bank wants to say Black Lives Matter, well, the proof is in the money. And I know that they and other banks, have made some moves, and I appreciate that for sure. But that is kind of one resource of funding that has always been in the background when it comes to funding anti-racism work. And I feel like now more than ever, it's a time for us to be knocking on those doors and asking them to contribute. Because, I mean, we are funded purely through the ECF, so purely through philanthropic funding. But obviously that tap has to be turned off at some point. And so I feel like it's time for corporate Canada to kind of step up in this area as well.
That's a great point. Yes, definitely the private sector could chip in here and try to support these initiatives, not just necessarily just, again, to go back to the idea of, okay, we're checking this box by just talking about it or advertising about it and so on. Yeah. All right, any additional final thoughts that you would want to add to the conversation? This has been a really interesting conversation, but we are getting closer to the end. We have a few minutes left in case you would like to add a few notes. Yes, Mohammed, please.
Yeah, I'll just say, because I do have a hard stop at 4:30 as well, but at 4:30 Toronto time, and
Yeah.
but you know, the one thing I'll say is that in order to really kind of figure out your own acts of solidarity, if they mean something, you need to have to invest the time in building strong relationships. And what I would do, just as a personal piece of advice, is, you know, build a strong network of people who you can check in with, who you can be vulnerable to, who you can hear and understand, and have the honesty to be able to be held accountable to.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't have them, find them and go for long walks and build those relationships, because I think that's where you'll really understand. And, you know, in terms of holding organizations accountable, there's 1,000 ways of doing that, but more so, keep yourself accountable.
Mm-hmm.
And figure out, you know, how are you holding that truth, and sleeping with it. And beyond all of it, you know, just having a soft heart and having the generosity to both accept acts of solidarity, and to make sure you step in when you see something wrong. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you, Mohammed. It's as you suggested earlier, it just goes back to that drive, right? That will. When there is a will, there is a way, like to have that commitment on a personal basis, right? So that we would actually go out there and look for opportunities, not just wait for different organizations to approach us, right? So yes, it begins with ourselves as the first step. I definitely agree with that. Samir or Cam, whoever wants to go next to add any final thoughts.
I would echo what Mohammed said about, being in a position to be forgiving of, other people and yourself in terms of doing this work, because it is hard work, and it's not, there's no one single book or film or experience that turns you into an expert on this. It's kind of it's a journey of lifelong learning, I would say. And so it's something that you have to pace yourself with. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And I would just keep that in mind as we go through this work, and remember to kind of take care of your own mental health, especially when we're all dealing with a global pandemic at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
And I wanted to, thinking about the de-escalation guide that Samir was talking about, was in a lot of ways, there is not, and I think Mohammed mentioned it earlier, we all come at this from different ways and aspects and different comfort zones. There's not one way to do it. And so I applaud the people that have gone out to the Black Lives Matter rallies, and the young people, because they're doing something that I'm not comfortable doing. And even though I have been out to rallies and other things to support different things. There are people like me that will do it within organizational context or policy context or whatever, within my own family or my own community. I think go where you're at, and it might just be on one issue or one incident that you step up to be that act of solidarity. It may be at the background, you may be leading from behind, or you could be at the front, at those marches, or in front of a community or in front of an organization. And so I think it's to go with your comfort zone. And I think it was mentioned, at the end of the day, you got to look at yourself in the mirror and say, have I taken a stance on this? Am I authentic to my own faith, my own community, to myself? Can I go to sleep knowing I did the best I could? And so we're all at different areas of that. So.
Exactly. Yes. Thanks so much. Yes, we all have a responsibility right, when it comes to anti-racism work. And as long as we're committed to our personal, authentic journey, I think, to challenge discrimination and racism and to work for systemic change in our communities, I think that would be a great part of the move towards acts of solidarity and allyship. Whereas, of course, issues such as funding, resources, and being heard in different communities are things that need attention from governmental organizations and the policymakers, whether they're federal or provincial or municipal, to just make sure that there are those outlets, there are those spaces out there for people who are more interested to collaborate, to make systemic change happen in the community. All right, I thank everyone, all three of our guest speakers, Mohammed, Cam, and Samya, for being here with us today. This was a great opportunity for us to learn more about your personal and professional work. And I would like to remind everyone that we have a feedback form. The link is shared in the chat box with you. Please take a few minutes. It's a very short feedback, but it will help us definitely to plan better for our sessions to come. Again, a reminder that we are going to have the second part of this roundtable, Anti-Racism and Acts of Solidarity, on the 25th, the same time. There are still spots open, I think a few, if I'm not mistaken, maybe they are gone by now, but then there is a waiting list. Feel free to add your names there. And of course, the recording of these sessions will be available on our initiative webpage. So stay in touch. And also on our Facebook page. Have a good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for your continued support. Stay in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Have a good evening.